Have you ever felt as if God were silent at the very moment you most needed an answer? Perhaps you prayed, waited, and wondered why nothing seemed to change, as if heaven itself had fallen silent. Now imagine the scene in John 8, a woman surrounded, exposed before everyone, intense accusations coming from all sides, the Pharisees pressing Jesus for an immediate answer, and a crowd standing in suspense, waiting for him to speak. But instead of answering immediately, Jesus does something that almost no one notices. Most people focus on what Jesus wrote on the ground, but few stop to notice that he bends down twice. This small detail changes everything. If you're tired of waiting for God to act, what you're about to discover may explain why silence often precedes a miracle. In that powerful moment, Jesus' silence before the miracle wasn't hesitation, weakness, or uncertainty. It was intentional. It had meaning. And hidden within this tiny biblical detail is a message for anyone who feels their life is stuck, for those exhausted by the delay, for those who wonder if God's silence has a purpose. Have you ever gone through a phase where all the voices around you demanded an answer, but all you received was silence? Perhaps you have more in common with this moment in John 8 than you realize. What makes this even more mysterious is that Jesus didn't repeat this gesture by chance. He wrote on the ground, stood up, spoke, and then bent down again. Why do the same thing twice? In the ancient Jewish world, repeated actions often reinforced divine testimony, judgment, or confirmation. This means that this hidden gesture may reveal much more than most biblical studies mention. Stay with me until the end, because what you are about to discover in this double silence of Jesus may completely transform how you understand waiting, mercy, and the moments when God seems silent. And the next part of this story reveals why this second movement toward the ground matters even more than the first. Perhaps that's precisely why this detail speaks so deeply to the soul of those watching now. Because all of us, at some point, have faced that uncomfortable place between question and answer, between pain and miracle, between silence and the voice of God. And when Jesus bends down for the second time, he seems to show us that even silence has direction, that even waiting carries purpose, even when the heart is already weary. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you most so far. I really want to know if you have also experienced a phase where it seemed that God was silent, but then realized that he was preparing something greater. Your experience may be exactly the answer that someone else needs to read today. And if this message is already speaking to you in some way, take the opportunity to leave a like. It may seem like a simple gesture, but it greatly helps the video reach other people who are also experiencing a period of waiting, confusion, or spiritual silence. Sometimes, a single reflection like this arrives at the right moment to stop someone from giving up. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, taking these messages further than we imagine. And if you feel that this type of biblical revelation, which goes beyond words and delves into the gestures, silences, and hidden attitudes of Jesus, strengthens your faith, subscribe to the channel now. Jesus Beyond WRDSTO. Continue walking with us on these profound discoveries. Here, every detail of the scriptures can be transformed into guidance for real life, especially in moments when everything seems at a standstill. And the most impressive thing is that Jesus' second gesture not only responded to that crowd, he began to reveal something much deeper that will completely change the course of this story. It is precisely in the weight of this scene that the hidden truth begins to gain strength. In John 8, we are not seeing just a religious discussion. We are facing a trap carefully set behind the scenes. That woman, caught in adultery, is brought to the center as if it were just a case to be resolved, but behind it lay something bigger. The religious leaders wanted to force an immediate decision from Jesus. The tension in the atmosphere was almost unbearable. There were voices, stares, judgment, pressure, and an entire crowd waiting for a quick answer, as if the value of that moment depended on the speed of the reaction. And isn't that exactly how our own journey often unfolds? Life puts us in situations where everything around us demands an answer, a decision, an immediate change. People ask questions, circumstances tighten, the mind races, and inside, the soul just wants to understand why God is still silent. This is the universal pain that makes this passage so powerful. The agony of waiting while everyone around you seems to demand that something happen now. Perhaps you have already experienced this in a relationship, in a financial crisis, in a phase of personal transformation, or even in decisions that could change the entire course of your story. The impact of Jesus' silence in this scene is precisely to break the human logic of haste. While everyone wants speed, he chooses depth. While the prosecution wants exposure, he prepares revelations. While the pressure demands a sentence, he leads the situation to a much deeper place of truth. This completely changes the mindset about waiting. Not all silence represents absence. Sometimes, it is the space where God separates the noise from the truth, appearance from essence, accusation from conviction. It is at this point that this passage ceases to be merely a biblical account and becomes a mirror of our own lives. How often do we suffer not only from the pain of the problem, but from the weight of external expectations, from unanswered questions, from the fear of judgment, and from the feeling that everything needs to be resolved immediately? Jesus shows that not every answer is born in the heat of the moment. Some of the greatest transformations begin precisely in the silence that seems uncomfortable. And when we understand this, Jesus' second movement toward the ground begins to reveal an even stronger meaning within this journey. Comment below, that makes sense to me. This is where we get to the heart of the hidden truth of this passage. The detail that almost always goes unnoticed is not just the fact that Jesus wrote on the ground, but the complete sequence of the gesture. He bends down, writes, stands up, speaks with authority, and then bends down again. This repetition doesn't seem casual. On the contrary, within the biblical and cultural context, it carries a much greater impact than a simple visual action. The question that changes the whole mindset about this moment is precisely this: why repeat the same gesture? In ancient Judaism, repeating an action carried profound weight. It wasn't just style, it was symbolic language. Often, a repeated gesture reinforced a statement, testimony, confirmation, or final authority. It was as if the truth was being established beyond question. This completely changes how we view John 8. Jesus isn't just buying time or ignoring the pressure from the Pharisees. He's guiding that situation through a sequence laden with meaning, almost as if revealing a spiritual decision behind the scenes even before the words are understood. Notice the transformation this brings to the interpretation of the scene. The first movement toward the ground creates a pause, interrupts the logic of the crowd, and slows down the avalanche of accusations. Then, upon rising, Jesus utters one of the most impactful phrases in the entire passage, exposing the hypocrisy hidden behind the appearance of justice. But it is the second bowing that amplifies everything. It reinforces, confirms, seals. It is as if silence becomes a second witness, bringing even more weight to the truth that was being revealed. And this resonates deeply with our own journey. How often does God seem to repeat processes, silences, or situations in our lives, not to hold us back, but to confirm something greater? In important decisions, in phases of inner transformation, or in moments when the soul seeks answers, repetition may not be a delay, it may be confirmation. The spiritual impact of this gesture lies precisely in showing that some revelations need a second movement to be fully understood. When Jesus returns to the ground, he is not merely repeating a gesture. He is separating appearance from essence, human judgment from divine truth, and leading that story to a much deeper level of revelation. And it is precisely there that the double silence begins to show its most powerful function. Write this down: I'm on this journey too. The two gestures mark the beginning of the most powerful revelation. What happens between the first moment Jesus bows down and the second is not merely a narrative pause. It is a silence charged with discernment, transformation, and hidden truth. This interval separates two forces that often become confused in our own journey: human accusation and divine conviction. And understanding this difference completely changes the mindset with which we perceive guilt, mercy, and restoration. In the initial silence, Jesus dismantles the backstage of false justice. While the religious leaders try to use the woman's pain as a trap, he does not respond in rhythm with the pressure. The initial silence exposes something much deeper than her visible sin. It reveals their invisible hypocrisy. The crowd was focused on the woman's wrongdoing, but Jesus shines a light on the heart of the accuser. That is the impact of the first gesture. He does not deny the gravity of the sin, but rejects the lie of a judgment tainted by pride, manipulation, and spiritual pretense. This is where the phrase really takes on its power. Mercy does not ignore sin, it destroys false judgment. Mercy does not deny sin, it destroys false judgment. This truth has enormous power because it touches something we have all experienced. How often is the pain not only in the mistake made, but in the weight of condemnation, in external voices, in the fear of what others think, in decisions made under shame? Jesus shows that true mercy is not permissiveness, but liberation from that which distorts the truth. Then comes the second silence, and it carries another layer of revelations. After the accusers are confronted and the emotional dust of the scene begins to settle, this new settling prepares a completely different environment. Now there is no more trap, hostile crowd, or religious theater. The space has been cleared. The second gesture prepares mercy for the woman. It is no longer about exposing hypocrisy, but but about restoring dignity, repositioning identity, and opening a new journey based on truth and transformation. This double silence reveals a profound pattern that also appears in our lives. First, God separates the noise, then He deals with the heart. First, He removes the wrong voices, then He releases direction. And when this order is respected, the restoration ceases to be superficial and becomes real. It is precisely at this point that Jesus' mercy begins to touch not only the error, but the future of that woman. Comment below, mercy changes everything. This passage ceases to be merely a scene from John 8 and begins to touch our own story in an intimate way. Perhaps the most difficult part of silence is not the absence of an answer, but the fact that we don't understand why it exists. The mind creates scenarios, the heart wears down, emotions fluctuate, and the weariness of waiting shapes decisions, mindset, and even how we see ourselves. That's why this revelation is so powerful. Perhaps God's silence in your life isn't absence, it's separation. Separation between human voices and true divine conviction. How often is it not the problem itself that suffocates us most, but the noise around us? Opinions, expectations, judgments, fear of the future, guilt for the past, anxiety about what has not yet happened. All of this mixes together and creates an internal pressure similar to that crowd in John 8, demanding an immediate response. And in the midst of this noise, we interpret silence as distance, when in fact God may be doing exactly what Jesus did in that scene, separating accusation from truth, fear from direction, guilt from transformation. This is one of the greatest spiritual impacts of this journey. Before releasing clarity, God often silences the wrong voices. Before revealing the next decision, He works behind the scenes of the soul, dismantling lies that seem like truth. This requires a profound change of mindset, because our tendency is to associate silence with rejection, when often it is protection. Not all delay is negative. Sometimes it is the necessary space for the hidden truth to come to light without being distorted by despair. Perhaps you are experiencing exactly this right now. A phase where it seems like nothing is moving forward, where answers aren't coming, and the feeling of a stuck life weighs more heavily each day. The weariness of waiting without understanding why generates emotional exhaustion, anxiety, and even the impression that faith is weakening. But what if this silence is separating what people have said about you from what God is truly building within you? What if this time is clearing the backstage of your heart so that the next stage of your journey is not guided by fear, but by conviction? When that switch flips, the waiting ceases to be punishment and becomes preparation. And it is precisely at this point that the silence begins to reveal not only what God is removing, but also what He is about to restore. Comment below, silence has a purpose. Perhaps the greatest revelation of this passage is realizing that the miracle didn't begin when Jesus finally spoke. In fact, it began much earlier, at the very moment He chose silence twice. This detail completely changes how we perceive the behind-the-scenes aspects of transformation. Our tendency is to think that everything begins with the visible response, the spoken word, the change that finally appears before our eyes. But John 8 reveals a much deeper hidden truth. The miracle process began in the silence, the discernment, and the separation that Jesus built before any final declaration. This has a huge impact on our own journey. Before the answer comes discernment. Before the miracle comes separation. Before restoration comes the exposure of hypocrisy, false narratives, and voices that were occupying a space that should never have been theirs. Jesus not only protected that woman from false judgment, He reorganized the entire spiritual environment of the scene so that mercy could act without being confused with permissiveness. This order matters. First the truth is revealed, then grace repositions the future. Perhaps that's exactly what's happening in your life. You look at the silence and think nothing is changing, when behind the scenes God may be preparing clarity, adjusting your mindset, dismantling internal accusations, separating guilt from conviction, and removing influences that distorted your decisions. Transformation doesn't always begin with something you can see. Often it is born in what seems like absence, but is, in fact, deep preparation. It is in this silent space that truth takes shape, that the heart matures, and that the impact of future choices ceases to be guided by anxiety. If you're tired of waiting, perhaps this period of silence is preparing exactly what your soul needs most: mercy, clarity, and breakthrough. Perhaps God is clearing the way behind your journey so that the next answer will not only be quick, but definitive. What seems to take time may be the invisible construction of what will sustain the next season of your life with more truth, more maturity, and more peace. And when that switch flips within us, we begin to realize that silence didn't delay the miracle, it was the beginning of it. Comment below, my waiting has a purpose. If you've made it this far, you may have already realized that this wasn't just a study of what Jesus wrote on the ground, but a revelation about those moments in life when silence seems too heavy to understand. And if this message brought clarity to your waiting, your pain, or any phase where everything seems stuck, it's well worth continuing to walk this path with us. Subscribe to the channel. Jesus Beyond WRDS, because that's exactly the kind of content we delve into here: the gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus that conceal teachings capable of transforming our real-life journey. And I would really like to know that you stayed with me until the end of this reflection. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "My waiting has a purpose." In addition to marking that you've made it this far, this also strengthens this community of people who are learning to find meaning even in the most difficult silences. If this conversation resonated with something you're experiencing today, leave a like naturally, as if to say, "This spoke to me." This simple gesture helps this message continue to reach people who also need to understand that, often, miracles begin in silence. And there's a video here that perfectly complements this topic, further exploring how Jesus used small gestures to reveal great spiritual truths. Click and continue with me there, because this journey of revelations can still touch areas of your life that you may not have even noticed until now.